There is a number I keep coming back to. Not a theory, not an interpretation, a number, a date range, one that appears across survey after survey, continent after continent, in documents filed by men who had no knowledge of each other's work, no shared language, no institutional connection, and in many cases no access to the same physical world. Between 1840 and 1890, that is the window, 50 years. And the reason I cannot stop thinking about it is not what happened during those years. We have rough explanations for that, contested, incomplete, but rough. The reason I cannot stop thinking about it is what disappeared during them, because what disappeared was the same thing in every case, on every continent, across every biome, regardless of which empire was doing the clearing, regardless of the indigenous tradition that had maintained what was being cleared, regardless of ecosystem, climate, or crop. The forest, not all forest, not random forest, specific forest, ancient, deliberately layered, multi-species productive forest, the kind that the botanical surveyors arriving just before the clearing consistently described using language so similar across languages that when you read the translated accounts side by side, something begins to feel wrong. Arranged, convenient, designed, the kind that fed people for generations without requiring what we would now recognize as agriculture. And then within 50 years it was gone. Not gradually, not the way forests naturally yield to farming pressure over centuries. Gone in a window so compressed that the transition barely registers in the official record before it is already complete. I have spent a long time going through the documentation on this, much longer than I expected when I first started pulling the thread. What I found was not the story of deforestation in the sense we normally use that word, the gradual economic trade of trees for farmland, for timber, for development. What I found was something more precise than that. Something that once you understand what specifically was cleared and what specifically replaced it, becomes very difficult to explain using the tools the official record provides. This video is about what was there. It is about when it was removed. And it is about a question I have not found anyone in mainstream historical writing willing to ask directly. Why the same 50 years? Let's establish the baseline first, because most discussions of ancient forests skip the most important part. The forests I'm talking about were not wilderness. That word carries an assumption, randomness, the absence of human intent, that does not apply to what the pre-1850 surveys were describing. What the botanical surveyors of the early 19th century documented repeatedly in field notes that were filed and archived and largely forgotten was not random distribution of useful species. It was concentration, consistent, geographically stable, recurring concentration of edible and medicinal and structurally useful trees growing in combinations that trained naturalists, men whose job was precisely to understand what natural forest looked like, kept describing using the same word, impossible. A British naturalist documenting the forests of the Malay Peninsula in 1828 described the interior as containing what he called an impossible density of fruiting species in an order that defied the expected randomness of natural growth. He was not a romantic. He was filing a colonial survey for an administration that wanted to know what the land could produce and how quickly it could be converted to plantation agriculture. He was describing something that contradicted everything his training told him natural forests should look like. A French botanist working in the interior of what is now Cameroon in 1831 wrote with unmistakable frustration that the vegetation he was cataloguing refused to behave as natural vegetation should. The useful species were too concentrated, too regularly arranged, too consistently present in combinations that should not co-occur naturally. He wrote that the forest had, and I am translating carefully here, the character of intention. The character of intention, written in 1831 in Central Africa. The same phrase, in different words, appears in an American botanical survey of the Carolinas in 1838, in a Dutch survey of Java in 1841, in a Portuguese survey of coastal Brazil in the 1820s, different languages, different biomes, different continents, same observation. These were not romantics. They were not dreamers projecting beauty onto wilderness. They were professional surveyors trained to be precise, filing documents for colonial institutions that had no interest in ancient forest systems beyond what could be extracted from them. And they kept describing the same thing. The forest had the character of intention. This raises a simple but critical question. If this pattern was observable to trained naturalists across 4 continents in the first half of the 19th century, why does our historical record describe the same period as the moment humanity was discovering systematic agriculture for the first time? Let's start in West Africa, because West Africa gives us something specific. Across the coastal and near-coastal regions of what is now Ghana, Benin, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and Sierra Leone, there existed, before the consolidation of European colonial administration, a category of land that local communities protected with a force that combined legal authority, cultural weight, and spiritual sanction so thoroughly that separating them is probably impossible and probably misses the point. Ethnobotanists in the late 20th century gave these spaces a working English name, sacred groves. That name understates what they were. A French colonial administrator writing from Dahomey in 1887 was given permission to enter and catalogue a sacred grove near a coastal settlement. His survey, which exists in the Colonial archives in Paris, describes a forest of approximately 40 hectares maintained by community law, under which cutting, clearing, or harvesting inside the grove was prohibited except under specific ritual conditions controlled by hereditary custodians. He was meticulous. He listed species. He noted distributions. What grows inside, he wrote, is unlike any natural forest in the region. It contains species from other ecological zones, species that could not have arrived by natural dispersal, species that in aggregate produce food and medicine in sufficient variety to sustain a settlement of considerable size indefinitely. He did not understand what he was looking at because he had no framework for it. But what he was describing was a deliberately planted, deliberately maintained multi-species food system. The sacred designation was not superstition layered onto a natural resource. The sacred designation was the governance mechanism by which the biological system was protected across generations. The religion was the law. Then the colonial administration arrived and replaced the law, not because anyone decided specifically to destroy the food systems. The documents are clear that this was not the stated goal. The stated goal was land rationalization, modernization of tenure, the replacement of community-held traditional land rights with individual title systems that could be taxed, transferred, and developed. The practical effect was the removal of the only legal mechanism that had protected these spaces, in some cases for centuries. Once the sacred designation lost institutional backing, once the hereditary custodians no longer had authority to enforce the prohibitions, the grove became available. Available timber, available farmland. It was cleared. The same story with the same mechanism plays out across sub-Saharan Africa between roughly 1860 and 1900. Different colonial powers, different legal frameworks, different languages, same outcome, same window of time. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Now move to Southeast Asia. The Dutch colonial administration in what is now Indonesia implemented a series of land reforms between 1870 and 1900 that historians describe as the opening of the agrarian economy to private enterprise. What this meant in practice was the systematic conversion of communal forest land, maintained for generations under traditional aided law, into private plantation concessions growing rubber, coffee, sugar, and tobacco for export markets in Europe. The forests being converted had been documented in Dutch colonial surveys from the first half of the 19th century. One Dutch botanist, writing in 1848, described them as forests that appeared to have been arranged for the convenience of harvest rather than the indifference of nature. He listed species combinations that decades of subsequent ecological research has confirmed do not occur in those concentrations by natural process. By 1900, those forests were gone, replaced by monocultures optimized for export, systems that produced nothing you could eat directly, systems that required purchased inputs, systems in which no ordinary person could simply walk into the landscape and feed themselves or their family. Now move to the Indian subcontinent. The British Indian Forest Act of 1878 is one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in the history of land management, and it receives almost no attention in the mainstream historical narrative on food systems. What it did was simple and total. It reserved enormous categories of forest land that had been managed under traditional community governance for as long as the documentary record extends as Crown property. It created the category of reserved forest, land to which local communities were legally denied the access rights they had exercised for generations. The effect on the managed forest systems of the subcontinent was immediate and irreversible. The specific knowledge of which species to plant together, which trees to select for over generations, how to read a landscape as a food production system rather than a timber resource, existed in the relationship between communities and the land they had managed. When the law removed that relationship, the knowledge broke. Within 2 generations, landscapes that the botanical surveys of the 1820s and 1830s had described with the same characteristic frustration of the colonial naturalist encountering something his training gave him no language for, were either stripped for commercial timber or standing in a form that the communities who had maintained them no longer had legal access to maintain. Now move across the Atlantic. The story in North America is both better documented and more deliberately obscured than the versions from other continents, and the combination of those two facts is itself something worth sitting with. Before sustained European contact across the Pacific Northwest, the Great Lakes region, the Ohio Valley, and throughout what is now California, indigenous peoples maintained food production systems of extraordinary sophistication. The Kalapuya of the Willamette Valley burned their landscapes on precise seasonal cycles to manage the growth of camas bulb meadows and oak groves, producing mast in quantities that supported dense populations without any recognizable agriculture in the European sense. The early colonial observers who encountered these managed landscapes were almost universally confused by them. They described the American interior as park-like, groomed as if someone had designed it, which of course someone had for thousands of years, at landscape scale. The first formal British colonial survey of the Carolina Piedmont in the late 1600s described groves of pecan, walnut and chestnut trees, so well spaced and tended that an Englishman might mistake the whole for an orchard of great age. He was almost certainly correct. It was an orchard, a food forest maintained across generations by people who understood that a properly placed and tended tree would feed your grandchildren's grandchildren without your grandchildren needing to do anything at all. Then the clearing began. And here is what doesn't get said about it often enough. The clearing of indigenous food forest systems in North America was not principally the story of individual settlers moving west and cutting trees for farmland. That happened. But the documentary record shows something layered beneath it that moves much faster and follows a much more deliberate pattern. Legal mechanisms. The General Allotment Act of 1887. The reservation system. The forced relocation of communities from the specific landscapes they had managed for centuries to places where their transgenerational knowledge of species combination and forest succession had no application. You did not need to cut the trees if you removed the people who tended them. The forests, without their communities, reverted. Not to wilderness in the romantic sense, but to something that looked like wilderness to the administrative eye. And what looks like wilderness to the administrative eye is available for classification, for reservation, for commercial timber rights, for homestead acts. By the time the United States conducted its first systematic timber surveys in the 1880s, forest coverage documented by colonial surveyors just 2 and 3 generations earlier had already been transformed beyond recognition. The oral knowledge that went with it, the specific understanding of which species to plant together, how to read a forest as a food production system, went with the communities that held it. Now let's look at the timeline. And I want to be precise because precision is what makes this so difficult to resolve. England Enclosure Acts peak, 1750 to 1850. North America, systematic removal of indigenous forest management, 1780 to 1890. West Africa, sacred grove dismantlement under colonial administration, 1860 to 1900. Southeast Asia, communal forest conversion to plantation, 1870 to 1900. South Asia, British Forest Acts removing community access to managed landscapes, 1865 to 1894. Latin America, clearing of ancient food forest zones, 1850 to 1920. Look at those dates, not across a century. Not the slow march of agricultural expansion across millennia, the core of the clearing, the moment at which the transition from managed multi-species food system to something else accelerates beyond any rate of natural change, falls in almost every case within the same compressed window. 1840 to 1890. One human lifetime. And I need to be specific about what makes this so difficult to explain. This is not deforestation in the broad sense. Europe lost forest to farming gradually across thousands of years. That is a different phenomenon with different causes and a different timeline. What I am describing is something more narrow. The targeted removal of a specific type of forest. Old, layered, deliberately managed, multi-species, food-producing forest. Not trees cleared for timber or farmland as an incidental byproduct of settlement. The deliberate, legally structured, institutionally organized dismantling of systems that had fed communities without purchased inputs across as long as the archaeological record can confirm. The official explanation for why this happens simultaneously across every continent is modernization. The spread of agricultural enlightenment, the inherent superiority of monoculture production, the natural march of civilization. The official explanation collapses here. Modernization does not coordinate itself across disconnected colonial empires. The British administration in Bengal, and the Dutch administration in Java, and the French administration in Dahomey, and the American government implementing the General Allotment Act, were not sharing policy memoranda about the specific management of ancient food forest systems. There is no documented coordination between these entities on this outcome. They were operating under different legal systems, different economic pressures, different crop regimes, different political structures. And yet, the outcome, in every case, was identical. And the timeline, in every case, was the same. The coordination problem is the part that doesn't go away when you try to rationalize it. If it were ideology spreading naturally, the timelines would vary by decades according to the speed of ideological transmission across colonial networks. If it were economic pressure spreading naturally, the timelines would vary by commodity price cycles and trade routes. Neither model produces the geographic precision and temporal compression that the archival record actually shows. Something organized this. Whether that organizing force was institutional, ideological, or something that our conventional historical framework does not have clean language for, I genuinely cannot tell you. But the pattern is documented, the timeline is documented, and it demands more than the official record has ever offered. Let me tell you about something specific, because specific examples do more than patterns. In the highlands of what is now Sri Lanka, Buddhist monastic communities had maintained what colonial surveys consistently describe as forest gardens for at least 1,000 years before British administration arrived. These were not decorative. Species lists from late 18th century surveys show extraordinary concentrations of fruit trees, nut trees, medicinal plants, and nitrogen-fixing species in arrangements that soil scientists working in the region today describe as evidence of deliberate composition extending back across many generations of management. The British administration implemented the Crown Lands Ordinance of 1840. Under that legislation, any land that could not be proven to be under active cultivation in a manner recognisable to British legal standards was declared Crown property. Forest land did not meet the standard. Overnight, legally, the forest gardens became available. By 1880, the hill country of Sri Lanka was planted in tea, a monoculture so complete that the biological memory of what had been there was erased, not just from the landscape, but from the institutional record. The colonial botanical surveys of the post-1850 period in Sri Lanka do not describe what was cleared, they describe what was planted. The transition is invisible in the official documentation because the official documentation begins after the transition. That is not accidental. Archival systems document what the institution cares about. What was there before the conversion is absent from the record because the institution had no interest in preserving its memory. Here is something that I think gets overlooked in almost every discussion of this period. Agricultural reform literature from the mid-19th century, and I have spent considerable time in this material, discusses at exhausting length the inferiority of traditional farming methods, the inefficiency of communal land systems, the necessity of the modern approach. What it almost never does is engage with multi-species food forest systems as a category, not to debate them, not to dismiss them, not to acknowledge their existence as something requiring replacement. You don't argue against something you want people to forget existed. The silence in the reform literature is not a gap in knowledge. The surveyors had documented these systems, the botanical networks knew what was there. The silence is a curatorial decision, a decision that this category of knowledge did not need to be carried forward. And here is the strangest part of that silence. The same decades that produced this complete absence of food forest systems from agricultural reform discourse also produced one of the most ambitious preservation projects in recorded history, the world-spanning botanical garden network. Kew Gardens expanding dramatically after 1840. The Royal Botanic Garden in Calcutta becoming a major institutional force. Bogor Botanical Gardens in Java. Singapore Botanic Gardens formalized 1859. Missouri Botanical Garden 1859. Garden after garden in the same decades the food forests were being cleared. These institutions are presented in official history as evidence of a simultaneous preservation impulse. While the forests were cleared, the gardens collected, preserved, honoured. Here is what they preserved: specimens, individual plants, genetic material. What they did not preserve, what they conspicuously did not attempt to preserve, was the relational knowledge, the specific combinations of species that made a food forest function, the succession patterns, the multi-generational management practices, the soil preparation systems, the timing of harvest that kept a system producing without exhausting it. They kept the parts, they discarded the instructions. A herbarium full of dried specimens tells you nothing about how those species function together in a living system. A seed bank tells you what grew, not how it was grown in relationship with everything else. The botanical gardens preserved everything except the thing that made the food forests work. Whether that was intentional, I cannot demonstrate. What I can say is that the outcome looks exactly like what you would design if you wanted to make the food forest system unrecoverable while appearing to care about what was lost. You keep the trees, you lose the forest. Now let me say something about trees that most people don't sit with long enough. A chestnut planted from seed takes 30 to 40 years to reach full production. An oak 80 to 100. A Brazil nut tree can take 15 years to begin producing and a century to reach maximum yield. What this means is that a food forest is not a system you build for yourself. You build it for your grandchildren. You plant trees you will never harvest from because your grandparents planted trees for you. The knowledge required to maintain a food forest is not botanical in the narrow sense. It is transgenerational. It exists in the relationship between a community and a landscape tended across many human lifetimes. The specific varieties selected over centuries for yield and resilience and compatibility. The soil preparations, the succession patterns, the timing calibrated across decades of observation. When you disperse the community, you don't just lose the people, you lose the knowledge. And when you clear the forest, you lose the embodied memory encoded in the specific selections made over centuries by people whose names no archive recorded. That knowledge, in every documented case I have examined, broke catastrophically. Not gradually, not in a way that allowed for partial recovery. Catastrophically, within one generation of the community's dispersal, within the same generation in which the forest was cleared. The official explanation is that superior knowledge replaced inferior knowledge, that monoculture agriculture with its yield data and its chemical inputs made the food forest obsolete, that nobody mourned what was lost because what was lost had already been superseded. The official explanation collapses here, because monoculture agriculture, by every measure that matters to the people eating from it, rather than the people profiting from it, did not produce more food. It produced more sellable food, more taxable food, more food requiring inputs purchased from someone else, more food requiring land rented from someone else, food that could be controlled. The transition was not from inferior to superior. It was from decentralized to centralized, from autonomous to dependent, from a system in which ordinary people anywhere they lived could walk into a landscape and eat, to a system in which eating required participation in an economic structure controlled by others. Who benefited from that transition? That is not a rhetorical question. It has specific, documentable answers. The plantation owners who replaced the food forests, the commodity traders who bought the plantation output, the banking institutions that financed the conversion, the colonial administrations extracting tax revenue from the new system, the seed companies emerging in the 1860s and 1870s that supplied the inputs the new monocultures required. These are not shadowy figures. They are documented. Their profits from the conversion period are in the historical record. The question is only why that record is never presented alongside the story of what was converted. There are places on this earth where pieces of the old system still stand. Not many, not enough, but they exist. Old-growth forest reserves in the Pacific Northwest where species compositions that ecologists describe in careful scientific language as anomalous concentrations of useful species persist in distributions that standard forest ecology cannot account for. Forest fragments in the Ethiopian highlands where wild coffee, Coffea arabica, grows in companion with shade trees and medicinal plants in arrangements that botanists freely describe as designed. Ancient hedgerow systems in England's Welsh borders where hazel, crabapple, elder, wild plum, cobnut and sweet chestnut, species that do not colonize together naturally, survive in combinations that preserve, in a contracted linear form, the structure of the open food forest that surrounded them before the enclosures came through. These places are restricted. Their access is managed. Their management plans specify minimal human interference. The papers published about their anomalous species compositions accumulate in academic journals with small readerships. The connection between what those papers describe and what the pre-1850 surveys described across entire continents is not drawn in mainstream literature. It remains, like so much else in this investigation, present in the record, visible to anyone patient enough to look, and absent from anything approaching public discussion. Why are they restricted? The official explanations are individually reasonable. Biodiversity conservation, indigenous land rights, research integrity, security designations. Each restriction has a stated justification. None of the stated justifications are implausible on their face. But here is the thing I find impossible to resolve. If you wanted to preserve the physical remnants of a food production system, not as a living practice, not as accessible knowledge, but as controlled evidence of its historical existence, restricted access is exactly what you would implement. You would not destroy the remaining stands of ancient managed forest. Destruction creates questions. Restriction simply creates inconvenience. You would label them sensitive. Root research about them through institutional channels. Let the papers accumulate in journals where they cannot aggregate into a narrative the public can follow. That is what has happened, whether by design or by the compounding bureaucratic logic of institutions that find it easier to control than to explain. The outcome is the same. Here is what I keep returning to. Before 1850, before the window opened, the archival record suggests that what we are calling ancient managed food forests were not remarkable anomalies. They were not exceptional pockets of sophisticated practice in a world of primitive foraging. The botanical surveys, the colonial field notes, the territorial descriptions, the ecological analysis of legacy soils and anomalous species distributions taken together, they suggest that managed layered, multi-species, food-producing forest was the default condition of large portions of the inhabitable earth. That is not a fringe claim. That is what the surveys say. And within 50 years, centered on the mid-19th century, it was gone. Not because the forests failed, not because they stopped producing, not because the communities who maintained them decided voluntarily to try something else, because a series of legal and institutional mechanisms implemented across disconnected administrative systems in the same compressed historical window removed the only protections those systems had. The commons were enclosed, the sacred groves were desecrated by administrative fiat. The adult forest laws were replaced by colonial land tenure systems. The indigenous land management practices were criminalized or their practitioners displaced. And the forests, which required nothing except to be left alone and understood, became available and were cleared. And the knowledge of what they were and how they worked and what they fed and what they meant broke within a generation. As it always does when you remove the community that holds it, as it was always going to do. I want to say something directly to you, whoever is watching this. I'm not telling you that a hidden empire planted the world's forests and was erased by a coordinated conspiracy. I don't have enough evidence to make that claim, and I won't make it. What I am telling you is that the official narrative, the one that describes food production history as a linear march from primitive gathering to sophisticated agriculture, with no meaningful detours, no lost systems, no bodies of knowledge worth mourning, is inadequate. Not to fringe evidence, to archival evidence, to the botanical surveys and the colonial field notes and the sacred grove documentation and the ADUP forest law records and the anomalous species distributions in the places we have fenced off and labelled sensitive. Something was there, something large, something that fed people and asked almost nothing of them in return. And in the space of 50 years across every continent on Earth, it was gone. The question that I cannot resolve, the question that I don't think the official record wants you to ask, is simpler and more devastating than any of the historical details. Who decided you shouldn't have it? Not when, not under which legal framework, not what word was used in the official documents for the thing that was taken. Who decided that a food system requiring almost no labour, no purchased inputs, no centralized infrastructure, a system that made ordinary people anywhere they lived substantially self-sufficient from the land, who decided that this was the thing that needed to go? And what does it mean that we live right now in the world they built instead? A world where the answer to hunger is always more technology, more purchased inputs, more centralized production, more dependence. A world in which the idea of walking into a forest and eating has become so distant that most people alive today cannot imagine it as a permanent condition of ordinary life. The forests were there, the knowledge was there, the systems were there, feeding people, requiring nothing from them except understanding. And in the same 50 years on every continent, within the same administrative moment, it was gone. Find me a natural explanation for that. Find me an official one. I'll be here, waiting.